Hello, okay, hopefully we've got some distance learning students with us. This is the first time we're trying this. You've got about 8 campus-based students here, and we've got Chris Lewis here to tell you all about crime statistics, which he used to be in charge of when he was my big boss at the Home Office before I left to become an academic. So he'll introduce the topic for you now.
Right, good afternoon. We have 2 audiences, one in this room, and welcome, and we don't know how many watching via the camera and the internet. You could be anywhere in the world, so welcome. What we're going to talk about is statistics. I'll talk generally about crime and justice statistics because I, in an earlier career, was in charge of them in the British Home Office. But most of the examples I'll give, but not all of them, will be about crime statistics. But there are plenty of other statistics that's on other aspects of justice, of course, prosecutions, sentences, prison, probation, etc. I've handed out a short questionnaire for people to have a quick look at in this room. For those of you not in this room, I'm asking people to just have a quick look at this first question. Where do you get your crime statistics or your crime and justice statistics from? And then what do you think about them? So I will talk through this, and anyone who's away, not in this room, you'll have to think about it by yourself. I'm suggesting that people talk about it for 2 or 3 minutes with each other. Now, what will happen is that people in this room are encouraged to ask questions about crime statistics. It is a workshop, it's not just a lecture. Although I say it myself, I am pretty well qualified to answer these sort of things. Those of you who are remote, you may have questions as well. You can obviously send them in, and we are picking them up as they come in, but the chances are that we won't be able to pick them all up and answer them during the course of this next hour and a half, hour and 3/4. But I guarantee that if they do come in and I can't answer them, I will send you an email in the next 2 or 3 days when I get back to my office. So let's think about crime statistics. And can I ask the people here, have a look at the piece of paper you've got in front of you. Any comments about where you get any statistics from? Do you get them from the newspaper, TV? Do you look at official releases of statistics? Do you use references that you happen to come across by accident? Do you just use your smartphone and tap in a Google search? Or do you actually not use it very much at all? Now, come on, be honest. What about you?
I routinely look at the official statistics releases because I'm quite interested in them.
Good. So somebody here has given a very positive answer. There are official statistics releases. They're on crime, they're on justice, or all sorts of things. You can look at them. Good. Well, I come back to you because I look at them as well, of course. What about you?
I wouldn't say I routinely look at official statistics, but
Yep.
that's where if I wanted them, I would look at the official websites rather than rely on newspaper or TV.
Okay. Can we keep on going?
I would say TV more because they're quite often on like BBC News, headlines, bulletins.
Right. Okay.
If I needed them, I'd go to the official statistics.
But you don't need them?
If I needed them for an essay, I would. I'd
Okay.
probably just read about them in the newspaper or something.
Okay. You want to say anything?
Official statistics.
Official statistics. Right. 2 gentlemen at the back, any comments?
Use my smartphone.
Sorry?
Use the phone.
Use your tablet, use your phone, okay. It works. Yes?
Yeah, again, I guess more kind of online news
Yeah.
reports and then open up if I need to.
Okay. It's very interesting because I gave this lecture previously and everyone else was very negative. They said stats are very poor. I'm not going to use them as much as, unless I have to. So they didn't actually make the answers. You've given a very positive set of answers. It'd be interesting to find out what the remote people are thinking. Well, what do you think about statistics then? We've got some suggestions here. They're all right, but they're pretty difficult to find and to understand. Or they're pretty useless at present. There's been a lot of bad press about them. Or survey data might be all right, but police figures are not very good. The fourth point is that there's too much fuss about statistics. People like me are pushing them, but really they don't play a great part in a student's appreciation. The fifth point could be that they're helpful for local crime problems, and the sixth point could be that they're actually a lot out of date. They haven't been brought up to date to take into account gun running, people trafficking, cybercrime, etc. So, any comments on that? Which of those would you agree with?
C.
You would agree with C. Survey is quite useful, but the police figures are not very good. Well, we'll go into this quite a bit during the course of this lecture. Anyone else want to pick up another point?
I couldn't choose between useless or deficient.
Right, but you're negative about them.
I think you've got to be careful when you use them, and you have to look at the methodological issues in collecting them, and look at how they're generalised, and you have to sort of appreciate their shortfalls to be able to use them sensibly.
Well, very good. Did you hear what she said? Because she could be giving this lecture. Because these are the points I want to make. That you shouldn't really just use figures that you get in the press. We look at a few press cuttings and take them apart. If you find the figures that are published on government websites, you need to be very careful about looking through the methodology. And then, of course, it's a question of opportunity cost, because, as you will see, there's an awful lot of detail published, and there's an awful lot of methodology published, and there's only 24 hours in the day. So you have to balance the amount of effort you put into statistics. When you've been doing it as long as I have, it's not so much effort. But basically, to understand stats properly is quite an effort, and you'll have to judge how much you want to put in to that yourself. The reason that we're here is to show the importance of crime statistics. From what you've said, most of you think they're reasonably important. I want to stress that official data is better than secondary comments. I want to show students the main sources and websites where you can rely on crime data. And I want to discuss the current criticisms, especially of crime data, because they are many. And I'll try and talk about the ways in which these criticisms are being addressed. And they're being addressed by a top-level government committee on which I happen to sit. I don't get paid for sitting on it. I wish I did. And that describes what I do. So I'm trying to help the government improve crime statistics. So if anyone has any ideas, then just pass them to me, and I'll pass them through to this committee, and we'll talk about them. What I want you to do now is to think from scratch about why statistics, crime, or crime and justice, why they might be useful, how they could be useful, either to you or to the police or courts or judges or to the government or to the public generally. So spend 2 or 3 minutes talking about the reason why crime statistics could be useful. Or if you want to talk about prison statistics, talk about that. And are we getting any comments yet from anyone? Not yet, okay, right. And if you want to think aloud, please do think aloud. The next slide shows what I think are the answers, but the answers as such are not on Moodle, so you won't have been able to see what I think the answers are. We need something now to say the equivalent of this page is blank. That we are doing something, but I'm not talking.
Maybe they're useful to politicians, useful to the public, useful to the police.
And I know that Tom has to go, so I'll ask him first of all. What in the last, how many years have you been working in this area? 25?
30.
Yeah, because they can use that.
Pardon?
Nearly 30.
Nearly 30 years
Yeah, they can say
that Tom has been working in criminal justice.
That's what I mean. That
Um,
was just confirms that.
What's the most important reason that you would have used statistics for?
There are various reasons, but I think you have to ask yourself what else you've got if you don't have them. So my first use of them was in the Safer Cities programme. And the Safer Cities programme said, how much crime is there in a city and where is it? And despite all their flaws, you could use them in a relative sense. So it wasn't the actual amount of crime, but the difference between the areas was actually a first step towards looking at whether those areas were different, whether they needed different treatment. So using them in a relative sense.
Okay, so Tom has used them, and he's going right back to about 1985 when he used them in Safer Cities. Okay, any thoughts?
It's good to see if you're working like towards current targets, it helps set new targets as well.
What you're thinking about, give me an example of a target.
So, say for instance, you've got, I don't know, take Portsmouth for example, there's a high rate of burglaries.
Yes,
Hampshire and Surrey may want to say, right, we're going to target to reduce burglaries. So the official statistics by studying everybody, have you been the victim of crime, have you experienced this, will let them know how they're doing in reducing that crime.
right, good. So you've got a policy, you're trying to property mark or make a thing place more secure, reduce burglary, and you look to see whether it's happened. Okay, so that's a policy use of them. Any other uses?
I've run across validation between the police recorded data and the crime survey of England and Wales can show important differences.
Sorry, I thought I'd turn this off. Right, it's a slightly technical point. You've got two sources of data on crime, and you really want to know how they interact with each other, which one might be better, or whether one is better for some things, one is better for another. We'll talk a bit about that in a minute. Okay, that shows quite a bit of technical knowledge about it. Good. And any other points? Yes, please.
To manage how to set the number of officers in each area.
Very good, yes. You need, when you are planning numbers of policemen, numbers of prison guards, number of probation officers, prosecutors, you need to know if there are 10,000 murders, then you need a lot of policemen. If there are only 100 murders, you don't need so many policemen. So that's very important.
And women.
I beg your pardon. I was taken to task last night. I called somebody the chair because I thought she would want to be called chair and not chairwoman. And she was extremely angry and said she was chairman because man stands for everybody.
Right.
So there you are. Now today, you're telling me off the opposite direction.
Police officer.
Police officer, right. Gentlemen, any other uses of statistics?
Maybe slightly cynical, but we went for politicians because they can use it as a rhetoric to support their policies that they're working. If the crime figures, for example,
Right.
decrease.
Okay, so it's helpful for people at the top the top, whatever you call politicians, to be able to say their policies work. Right. Any more thoughts? I'll put the slide up now if there aren't any more. The first point here, I think, is the point that you made from Thailand. What is the size of the problem that law enforcement? And the second one, how much would that law enforcement cost? You know, if you suddenly find that tourist crime has gone up enormously, you just have to have more and more policemen in a tourist spot. There's no point in just ignoring it. You must know about it, you must measure it somewhere or other. And then the point 3 there is the other point that you raised, so you're on target, you're doing the right things, to appreciate whether specific policies are working, point you made, to reduce crime, no, you made it, to reduce crime. A point that we didn't make, but that's how are different groups affected? Are old people more likely to be victims than young people? Are women more likely to be victims than men? Are foreigners more likely to be victims than indigenous people, and so on? And then finally, are the policies cost effective? We could all build a great big fence around our house at a cost of £20,000, but it's not cost effective to do that. It's much better to put in a cheaper burglar alarm. So you have to think about how much your policies cost. And the point that Tom made about safer cities, a lot of money was put into making one part of Portsmouth very safe. And the big question, which is never really answered, is was it cost effective? The fourth point I've said is it's a bit connected with the point you raised about politicians. It's to reassure the public. If you can stand up and say, crime this year is 20% less than last year, and you're not blamed for fiddling the figures, and people do believe you, then the public are going to be very reassured. If on the other hand you have to keep going back to the public and saying, I'm sorry, the figures have gone up again, they are not reassured. For example, figures on immigration. Every time the current government has said we're going to reduce immigration, every time the statisticians measure it, it's gone up. The public is not reassured about immigration. And the other point about action at a local level, I think was made by you talking about burglaries in Portsmouth. So these are some examples, there could well be others, about the importance of crime statistics. Now, I'll summarize a few thoughts here. They are tricky. Crime statistics, all statistics are tricky, but you don't have to worry about having a degree in maths or A-level maths or anything like that. It's not maths you need to worry about. It helps, and you can do much more things with figures if you are a mathematical expert. But you don't have to have anything more than clear thinking. You have to ask such questions as this. What's the data for? Who collects it? Who defines it? And what are the limitations of the data? So let's have a quick couple of minutes. We want to know how many students are there at Portsmouth University. Okay? So let's think of that. Anyone want to make a comment? Is this an easy question? No, why not?
No, because we don't know it offhand.
No, none of us know it offhand, but it's actually quite difficult to define, isn't it? There are people remote from this room listening to us who may or may not be students. They may be thinking of being students. They may have been students last year. They may be students on another course. So you have to sort of make a definition. What is a student? Not always easy to define. You are students, you're signed up, you've paid your fees. But what happens if you sort of only attended one lecture and somebody's in the process of chopping you off the list? Are you still a student? What happens to people who've got their degrees but still stay on at the university because they can't find a job when they go to lectures? Are they students? You can imagine all sorts of extra questions that you might want to ask. But even once you've got a definition, you have to think, where am I going to get the answers from? Who am I going to ask to count? Is it the accounts office, where the money has come in? Is it people like us, who say there are 7 people in this room, therefore I will add up all the 7s? And then you find that if I count the students, what about the ones who don't turn up? If the accounts office counts the students, what about the people who don't pay their accounts? And so on. And then you have to ask, what's the question, what's the data for? Is it to know how many teachers that they're going to have, how many professors, how many researchers? Is it to know how many rooms to provide? Is it just to make a statement by the Vice-Chancellor that Portsmouth has now got 23,000 students and we're doing fine? So even a simple question like University of Portsmouth numbers of students, it's not obvious how you collect the data, what's the definition, and who actually collects it. So having said that, let's now get on to some crime statistics. This was the Mail Online, Daily Mail English newspaper, published online as well, for January 2014. And this was a very important month because it was the time when the government really got fed up with all the criticisms of crime statistics. This is crime, it's not prisons or anything, it's just crime. And they had given them a kite mark in the past which said, they're very good statistics, they're all right, you can believe them. And there were so many criticisms that in January 2014, the authority, the UK Stats Authority, withdrew the kite mark. They are no longer regarded as good statistics. And it'll be some time before we get back to that situation. And then the man in charge of the authority said, the figures overstate the truth. Now, Tom, do you know what that means?
Not really.
No, neither does anyone else, including him when he was asked. Police forces were accused of downgrading crimes or just not taking any notice of them. And a senior officer, you can always find a senior officer, he's probably a sergeant, who said rapes and child abuse disappearing in a puff of smoke. In other words, these crimes happen, please don't record them. And then it goes on because the Mail was against the government that week, and it said, comes as a blow to the coalition, dents trust in the police. Well, you would read that and you think, most of you probably because you're thinking people, is that what's true and what's not true. So let's tell you. Basically, it is true. The kite mark was taken away. It's not been given back. It won't be given back for several years. There was a strong suspicion that police crime stats were not fully what happened. They were understating what people reported to the police. As a result, the government made a lot of money available to the Inspectorate of Police, HMIC, and last year, summer 2014, something like £2.5 million was spent in investigating police forces. And indeed, it came up with the same answer. Police do misrecord crimes. In some cases, they're 20% below what they should be. But this is mainly, it's not for burglary, it's not for theft, it's mainly for violence and sexual offences. Which, of course, is what the senior officer previously said, rapes and child abuse. They are under-recorded. This got a lot of publicity, and we'll go into it a bit more if we have time today. Some improvements have been made, but it's going to be a few years before the police can be given the sort of correct statement that you're recording properly. We'll have to go back and have another survey of them. So the kite mark will not be restored yet. But despite all that, what does the word overstate the truth? They understate the truth, but he actually said overstate, which is fairly meaningless. So you've got a sort of reasonable mark for, this is 7 out of 10 for that journalist. Now another comment about the same time. Crime is really up 50%. Official figures ignore a slew of offences, a large number of offences, from card fraud to murder. And it's saying the survey data is no good because it ignores rapes, murders and crimes against children, and it ignores credit card frauds and bank card frauds. Right? So crime is really up 50%. But that's just a headline. They don't actually say what's meant by crime to be up 50%. So if you take this apart, there is much more crime than in the official figures. Card fraud is not included in the police or the survey figures, but we'll talk about it a little bit more in a minute. Crime against under 16s at that time wasn't included in the survey, it now is. And just be reasonable. If you're doing a survey of people, you can't ask them if they've been murdered. It doesn't make any sense. And actually, experience has shown that you can't ask people if they've been victim of a sexual offence. They won't tell you. Especially if you're asking a child who's she's the victim of an offence by her father, and her father is sitting on the seat next to her. She's not going to tell you. So you have to be realistic. I often said that we need a new paradigm, and we're gradually moving towards it. A new way of doing things, that's what I mean. But it's not right to say that crime is up 50%. It hasn't jumped 50% since last year. It might be 50% higher than the measures say. It might be a lot more than that, in fact. So every time you look at what's published, you have to think hard about what it really means. Now, you normally think, I've given you examples from the Mail. The Mail is not the best of newspapers. But you get to the broadsheets, Times, Guardian, Telegraph, Independent, they're regarded generally as quite good newspapers. And Alan Travis, who is an expert in this field, is a journalist who's been working for many, many years in this area. What he said last week, this is a quote from The Guardian last week, the crime rate has doubled to more than 11.6 million offences. This is most unlike Alan. I can't imagine why he said it like that. All I can think of is that he wrote something correct and the editor, the sub-editor, cut it back a bit. But that implies that crime's doubled again. Whereas that's not what he meant to say at all. So this rise is due to the inclusion of 5.1 million fraud incidents online and 2.5 million cybercrime offences. So, okay, that's another statement that's been made. And the third statement is a completely different statement. It says the crime's gone down by 8%, excluding all the things he said above. So it's not really the sort of thing the Guardian usually writes, which is a bit confusing and no different from the Mail. The analysis is correct, you can see what he's on about, but it's confusing. He's an experienced journalist. But if you read the document that in a minute I'll try and get up for you to look at, if you read that document, published statistics, it doesn't actually say anything about crime having doubled. All it says is that the Statistics Office has been trying to measure online fraud and cybercrime, and here is the methodological survey which piloted this sort of measure, and the figures are as Alan Travis reports. The pilot study said there were 5.1 million fraud incidents and 2.5 million cybercrimes. That has been added together by the journalist, a very good journalist, but it wasn't added together by the statisticians who published this. Nowhere in their document, which I've read thoroughly, do they say crime really should be 11.6 million or not. New types of data. It may not work. You may change your methods. And figures, that's the household survey figures, and they contain many other sources. The bulletin is 76 pages long, and it contains all sorts of other things. I'll see if I can get it up. Now this is on the Office of National Statistics website under crime, and it's very easy to find, but it's not very easy to understand. It goes down 76 pages of this. I won't go into the 76 pages, but you can just see there's a vast amount of methodology, there's a vast amount of comment, and it takes a long time before you get to any statistics. That's the graph, which, if you're interested in crime statistics, you will know that in England and Wales you have two measures. This is what the police measure, this is what households report. It's starting at 1981, going on to 2015. The police rose, dropped, rose again, and are now dropping, but are beginning to go up, mainly because the police are recording better. The household figures went right up and now have gone right back down again. They are very low. Can you see that? They have dropped to 6 million. They were up as high as 19 million. That's an interesting sociological phenomenon. People said 25 years ago there were 18, 19 million crimes. Now they say there are only 6. Now, people could change their view about what's crime, or people could do it the other way around and count more things as crime. That's been more likely. But this is the basic truth, perhaps in quotes. There's nothing particularly wrong with that figure, except you can't ask people if they've been murdered. It doesn't include sex, and it doesn't generally include people under 16. That's done separately. These are what the police record. The police only record what they've been told about, and they've recently been shown not to be recording everything properly anyway. So, if you want to find any figures on crime, it's now published. It's not published by the Ministry, by the Home Office, or by the Ministry of Justice. It used to be when I was in charge, but because there were so many suspicions of this, it was taken away from the Home Office and given to the Office of National Statistics, which is supposed to be much more independent. Right, see if I can get back to my slides. That's the main story. The main story of crime in this country is that there are 6.5 million incidents as defined by households. Police don't record all of them. They don't get told about all of them. And they're 4.3 million. The police figures are up, mainly because the police are recording better this year than they were last. The household figures are down, probably because households are getting better at stopping people committing crimes against them. The violence figures are up by 1/4. Right. Horrible figure. And you have to think very hard about that, because I did say, didn't I, that there was great criticism of police for not recording violence figures properly, and that's what probably has caused that figure, 163,000, to be 25% up on last year. So you have to think that possibly there are something like 200,000 violent offences going on out there that should be reported to the police. Last year, probably something like 125 were reported. Well, maybe more than that were reported. Last year, 125 were written down by the police as having taken place. This year, 163. Next year, probably 185. And it'll soon get quite close to the 200,000. That probably is the real count. So when you see any figures and look at how they've gone up or down, you have to think, has the recording changed? And you could, for example, change the definition of recording. I would think that if you went to any other country, you would find a different definition. Violence in this country is a very wide definition. Any kind of threat or insult can be recorded as violent. In France, in Germany, a violent offence means you have to have been to a doctor or been hospitalised for a day or two, or you're off work or something like that. We don't have that sort of definition. So you've got the problem of definition, and then Knife crime, probably up because knife crime has gone up. Probably, but we don't actually know, we can't be certain about that. Sexual offences have not gone up 41%, I'm sure about that. Might have gone up a bit, but the real reason for that is that forces are now recording them much, much better. Fraud is 9% up, and that's a much too complicated one to go into. I've got a slide on that, and we might get to it. But then there's been a pilot survey of cybercrime and online fraud, and this dwarfs, this is 7.5 million of these. But are they all offences? They're different sorts of offences. They don't necessarily have victims. Online fraud is sometimes dealt with by banks and you get your money back and you don't feel the victim. Cybercrime, somebody tries to hack you and you're very sensible, you have good passwords, etc., and good security systems on your computer, and it doesn't work. So these are really attempted crimes more than real crimes. So that's your main story about statistics. By now you've probably got to the point of thinking, I really want a simple answer. And I'm afraid there isn't a simple answer. But what you've got here is as simple an answer as I can give you at present. Now, does anyone want to ask any questions at this point? Yes, please.
There was a BBC News article I read the other day of, I think it was a chief constable in, I can't remember where it was exactly, but he made the point that his force, because of budget cuts, was specifically reducing the number of people they were targeting for cannabis offences. So do you think that could have an impact on drug offences, for example?
It might, but you then have to be a little bit careful because these figures do not include cannabis offences, right? No, that's a fact. Nobody tries to measure cannabis offences as such. They measure the number of times you catch somebody. But it's a cannabis offence to be wandering around with something in your pocket which you could smoke. And nobody has the faintest idea what that is. But you're quite right. You're talking there really about a slightly, not quite this statistic, another statistics, which is the number of cannabis warnings the police give, and the number of prosecutions on top of that. And I remember the chief constable saying, well, we've got to prioritise. We're after rapes and violence, knife crime, cannabis, down the order. If we've got spare time, we'll do that, otherwise we don't. So that's another point, that the statistics often reflect what the authorities do. It doesn't always reflect that. Murder, for example, is probably very, very well done. I'll come to a slide on that in a minute. Murder, it's not, you don't find the police find 800 bodies and that's it, and then they give up looking. The police are told about murders in all sorts of different ways, and it's probably about right, about 800 or something like that. But certainly, as far as things like catching people are concerned, if the police decide that they're not going to concentrate on cannabis, then they don't catch enough cannabis people, so the drug offences of that type are going to be much lower. You're quite right. And that's another fact that it's worth remembering, that some things are pretty obvious, they are real. The number of babies born is a real, that's a baby, you can see it. It's not that the doctors decided not to deliver a whole load of babies. Babies are born and that's it, and they tend to be born in hospital these days and to be registered. So that's a real figure. But the number of cases of measles or something like that, again, that's a figure, but it's not necessarily the total figure, because most people who get measles probably don't realise they've got measles and don't tell the doctor. So it's not just crime that's got all these questions about it. Right, so what are these official sources? That's the best website. It's almost inevitable that you're going to find it on a website nowadays. In my room, which is just along there, I've got all sorts of old books about statistics, but nowadays it's all on websites. That's the one. cav.uk, government statistics, and it'll bring up all sorts of ideas, different types of themes, crime, health, education, immigration, all that sort of thing. You can search by theme, you can search by department. Home Office is a department, Ministry of Justice is a department, Office of National Statistics is a department. You can search all these and you can get to the statistics that you want. So I'm going to just quickly run through 4 slides which ask questions, and then we have a little break and we'll see if there are any questions that have come in from outside or you want to give any. Is crime this year up or down on last year? Well, I've answered this to some extent. It's already there, it's in the bulletin, and the answer is it's either up or down depending on how you measure it, and if the recording has changed, then it might have gone up faster than it really should have, or it might have gone up when it really should have gone down. So the answer is, depends what sort of crime, depends how you measure it, and when in doubt, you just have to do an awful lot of digging or ask an expert like Tom or myself what he thinks about it, especially if you're writing a thesis and you want to use statistics in that thesis. How many knife crimes were there? That's an easier one because that again is in that same Office of National Statistics source. I don't know whether we can find it or whether it's even worth looking. We'll see, just keep on going and you'll find it. We'll get to knife crime eventually. But how fast, how long we have to go, I don't know. I'll probably give up. Theft, shoplifting, sexual offences, robberies. Yes, here you are. The number of offences that involved a knife or sharp instrument showed an increase of 4%. Okay, so right in the middle of all these statistics is, and there'll be a table somewhere, it is the information on knives, on firearms, and on robberies. So it's all there, but it takes a lot of digging into. What's happened? Now this is where you need to be very careful about what you're doing. How many frauds were committed last year? It's very difficult to define a fraud, and the statistics are changing, and this is the new paradigm, the new way of measuring things, and we're moving from the old way to the new way, and we're about halfway through. The local police don't really collect fraud anymore. It all goes to a central police organisation called Action Fraud, and there are other organisations for fraud against companies and things like that. And we've already mentioned online fraud, experimental measures of that. So that's a definitional point. I won't go through that one. But here is some figures on fraud which shows the changes that are being made. Police used to record fraud, 62,065, none. That doesn't mean that fraud has dropped to zero. It means that it's being recorded in this way. This place called Action Fraud, which is a central online fraud reporting place. 2 years ago, 117,000, the police still recorded 62. 1 year ago, 211,000, the police recorded just a handful. Now the police don't record any. Action Fraud records 230,000. So the total has gone up, 179, 211, 230. And it's now all collected by this body called Action Fraud. So you have to know about this. But then that's the sort of personal fraud that you might report to a policeman. You know, you've been defrauded, somebody asked you for £100 to invest in something, and he just never came back with it. If you go to bigger organisations of companies, fraud against companies, you're talking about big numbers, more than personal fraud, 389,000, and they are collected by bodies who are groupings of companies. There may be some more bodies we haven't got in yet. This is gradually getting more and more complete. So personal fraud you might tell the police about, company fraud, and at the bottom we've got the survey that we've already talked about, online fraud, the Crime Survey for England and Wales. It wasn't done then, it wasn't done then. It's been done for the first time now, and they've come up with a very, very simple estimate of 5.1 million. If you know anything about statistics, you know that's an estimate. It's probably between 4.5 and 5.5. We didn't count each one. We just asked several hundred people or several thousand people, and they reported back, and we grossed up these figures. It's a survey, it's a sample. So that's the answer to fraud. Very complicated, things are changing. Now it doesn't mean it's impossible, it doesn't mean that statistics are useless. It means you have to understand them a little bit more, and then you can write a nice little comment on that. I could write 3 or 4 paragraphs on that, and so could you when you've seen that. But it isn't yet getting into the published data in the simple way that I put it here. Now we'll pause. Are there any, Helen, are there any? There are no comments.
At the moment, I've just asked for some.
Okay, there are no questions from outside. Are there any questions from you? Or comments? Or yes, please.
When you talk about the police not recording the violent and sexual offences properly, what were they doing when a crime was reported to them? What were they doing with that information if they weren't recording it?
Right. Well, I've got some slides here which answer that question, and we'll go through them. Now, you're talking about violence, right? Well, let's talk about violence. I have a brother about the same age, a bit younger than me. When we were much younger, we sort of fight very seriously. But it could be that I was fighting my brother, right? Or he was fighting me, and it could be that people saw that and reported it to the police and said those 2 Lewis brothers are fighting again. Now, the police may or may not record that as a crime. It could just be a fight. Nobody else is interested. In theory, they should, because I might have had a black eye, I might have had to go see the doctor. And certainly in the past, it was up to the average policeman as to whether he records that sort of thing. Okay? It really happened, but was it worth recording? That was one example. Another example is a man living with a girlfriend or wife, a violent relationship, they both hit each other, the man is stronger, so he might hit his wife 200 times a week. Occasionally the wife grumbles to the police write it down, and then next day she goes along and says, I didn't mean it, forget about it. Now, at what point do the police start recording that? Because this is a typical problem in many parts of the country. Although the police know they should record it, in fact, usually the lady has come back in and said, I don't want you to record it, I don't want any prosecution. He's promised to behave himself. This may happen 100 times a year. The police have a difficult thing to do. And what has happened is that they don't always get it right. Sometimes there's an obvious offence which anyone would think is obvious. You don't have to be a feminist or anything like that. These offences have happened and they should be recorded, and sometimes the police haven't in the past. What happened last year was that they came from the inspectorate to places like Hampshire, and they looked at all the records that people had been phoning up, and they'd written it down, what had happened, they'd written it down, and then they went to see whether that had actually been recorded. And in a high proportion of violent cases, the police hadn't actually crimed it. The police knew what had happened, but they'd taken the decision not to crime it. They knew there was no action for them. They knew that the The victim wouldn't stand up in court, therefore the case could not be proved. So they decided not to crime it. They've now been told they've got to crime it, whatever the victim says, even if she's not, he's not willing to take the prosecution through. So that's another example. And then you get to the sexual offences in which a relationship has been going on for 3 years, heterosexual or homosexual, it doesn't matter. Sex has been part of that relationship, violence has also been part of that relationship, and then one or other breaks it up and goes off. And then they get back together for a bit, and what one person thinks is an ordinary set of relationships, which comes back with sex, etc., the other person thinks is violence, rape. And the police have to judge between the two. And what's happened is that the police have got it wrong in a high proportion of cases, like 20%, and that the more senior policeman who comes from the inspectorate has decided not to, that not recording has been a mistake, he told the police officer. So that's what's happening. It's not that there is some great malicious behaviour on behalf of the police, it's just that they have taken the wrong decision in 20% of cases. And 35 out of 43 forces have actively taken the advice of the inspectorate and are changing their behaviour, and 5 or 6 forces are still behaving in an old-fashioned way, and the inspectorate will have to go back to them. Now, does that help at all? Is that that sort of point?
Yeah, so it's the police judgment whether they record it as a
It's
crime,
the
but
police
they've been told now not
judgment.
to use their judgment, just
Yeah.
record it anyway.
I mean, if I make a pass at you and you say, I'll get lost, you will, whatever. Now, at a certain point, that becomes a crime if I started groping around and all that. But you may say you don't want anything done about it. But in theory, if you tell the police should record it as a crime. And that might be of quite importance to other students who want to come to my class. You know, if I'm groping young girls or young boys or whatever, I'm not the right sort of person to be teaching them. So it is important. And quite often in the past, people who eventually have been found guilty of something, they can say, well, in 20 years in which I was teaching, there was not one recorded incident. And it's because the police haven't recorded it that some people have got away with it for a very long time. Okay, any other questions? No, well, let's move on, because we've got a series of slides now which go into that a little bit more. These are the reasons that you might not report a crime to the police. I mean, first of all, you may not easily be able to access them. I mean, it seems daft now, we've all got telephones, mobiles, but you know, if you live on a remote island in Scotland or Wales or something like that, you may well not easily be able to access the police. The second reason is that you know who stole your bicycle, and you go and get it back from him and beat him up. You know that that will be the end of it. And the third one is that if a 10-year-old or 12-year-old is stealing money from his mother, she's not going to report it to the police because she knows the boy. She doesn't want to get him into trouble. And then you get to what I've been talking about before. If you go into the police in the past and reported a violent offence or something like that, and the police have not done anything about it, you're not going to go again. You've lost trust in the police. But probably more important is the point that was raised about cannabis there. At present, police are very busy. There are not so many police about, so you don't report something because you think they're too busy and they won't bother to investigate it. If it was a theft, a burglary, and you're not insured, you know, something worth £50 was stolen, what's the point of reporting that? Because the police won't find it, the insurance won't pay because you're not insured or you've got an excess to pay, so you're not bothering. online fraud, credit card fraud, something like that. The bank may give you your money back. You're not particularly worried because you've not lost out of it. Don't want to get the police involved. The bank don't want to get the police involved, so you don't report it. And then, you know, you might find that you're doing something with somebody else as a joint offence, and you know that this chap, you might argue with him afterwards, and you want to report him to the police that he was a burglar, but you don't, because you'd have to say, well, what were you doing there? You were the burglar as well, so it would incriminate yourself. And then there's a whole series of things that people don't realise is a crime. You know, all the migrants that have been trafficked across the Mediterranean, they're paying $1,000 to get a passport, etc. They're probably not sure whether it's a crime or not. So they don't tell the police because they don't realise a crime has taken place. Or people brought to this country and then forced to work as a domestic slave for 12 to 15 hours a day. They don't really think of that as a crime. They know it's bad behaviour, but they don't think it's a crime. So these are lots of reasons. There may well be others. Question, has anyone been the victim of something and not reported it? No? Perhaps you've never been the victim of anything. But certainly I've had credit card fraud against me. I've talked a lot to the bank about it, I've got my money back, but I've never even thought about reporting it to the police. Because I know, knowing police very well, they wouldn't have been very interested in it. So the police role in statistics is different depending on what crime it is. There's only a small part of what they do anyway. They're not there to collect figures. If they don't know about it, they can't record it. I don't think there's a conspiracy. There's a lot of incompetence, and there's been an overreaction to pressure from their sergeants and inspectors to get their performance up. So there are reasons, and I might show you occasions when the police have been quite nasty and quite malicious. But don't forget, it's very difficult to get 120,000 or more policemen to behave in a consistent way. And one of the great strengths of the British system is that policemen do have their own discretion. But you're basically saying in statistics there's no discretion, you've got to do what you tell them. So it's different from most of their training. And the next few slides are looking at how crime gets discovered. Well, with a murder, very good statistics. Police tend to get told all about things. They tend to pick up far more dead bodies in one way or another. They keep a record of all people who might have been murdered, and a lot of them are struck off because it turns out they just died a natural death. Well, that's really it, isn't it? Natural death. So their statistics are usually very good, and you can't do any survey of murders. Violence against the person. Police decide how serious it is. Classification varies from country to country. It's police's discretion. We count far more violence in this country than they do anywhere else. We count threats, we count attempts. Complicated rules if you get two people beating two people up. You know, are there 4 offences or 1 offence? It's a complicated matter. The rules are all written down somewhere. And as I've said, although the rules are there and the police do in fact find out a lot of violence, they do make mistakes. And they sometimes do not record it properly. And they've been clobbered by the inspector in the last year and a half. And they've been told to behave properly. Burglary, well, house security is much better than it was before, so burglaries have dropped by about half. You might have expected something like that to have happened. But many burglaries still don't get reported. They're too trivial. I reported a burglary, but after about a day I realised nothing had been stolen. Well, my windows had been broken. Some people don't trust the police, some deal with it yourself. All the usual things. And anyway, what is a burglary? France counts the theft from a car the same as the theft from a house. There's no reason why they shouldn't, it's just a different way of doing things. So they can't distinguish theft from a house from a theft from a car. Now, the big question about statistics is the police collect data. Right, fine. But who checks what the police do? And this is a timeline in which I don't think anyone else other than me would know or bother to write it down. In 1990, when I was in charge of the figures, nobody checked. I mean, I had some very good staff, but only a few of them. And if the figures looked odd, then they were queried. But only if the figures looked odd. You know, Debbie, who was the chief of the checkers, came in one day and said, there have been 600 rapes in Gloucestershire this year. Now, Gloucestershire is not very big. It's a mainly rural place. Rapes there would be about 20 or 30 a year, and there were 600. That just is wrong. Any statistician knows that's wrong. So, you know, I told her to check that, and it was a mistake. It was that somebody who'd been very new to collecting statistics, and he'd used the wrong set of rules. So we queried things in 1990, but it was too expensive to go out and inspect all 43 forces. In the year 2000, the rules were tightened up, and the police behaved a little bit better, more training was given, but still nobody checked. In 2010, the rules were tightened up again. The government got fed up with the Home Office and passed the publication of these figures to the Office of National Stats. But still, the collection, of course, has to be done by the police. 2011, they set up this advisory committee, but we tried to get more checks done, but until 2014, we couldn't get any checks done. And that was because going out and checking what the police do is a very expensive business. I don't think I would have believed it. You may find it difficult to comprehend. But last year, the inspectorate checked, in each force, they checked a sample of crimes that the police were recording or not recording. They came to Hampshire and they checked 500 crimes or 1,000 crimes or something. And it cost £2.5 million if you add in all the costs of people coming out and checking, writing all the reports and so on. That is an enormous sum of money. It's got to be found. You can pay several nurses and doctors for that. So the reason that checks are a bit spasmodic is because of the cost. There's a follow-up this year of the worst forces, and perhaps in 2016, depending on what the government says in its autumn budget statement in a couple of weeks' time, there may be some more checking. But I doubt if we'll get checks of statistics on the same basis as there was in 2014. But they'll probably get at the worst forces, because they all know which the worst forces are. And the report last year said victims are being let down. 800,000 crimes have gone unrecorded each year, that's about 20%. Violence and sexual offences were 33% under-recorded and 26% under-recorded. This is wholly unacceptable. And then they went on and they said, hey, wait a minute, you may have recorded it in the first place, but then you decide later on to cancel it. If, for example, somebody finds a body in the street, it looks as if they've been murdered, blood all over the place, etc. They record it as a murder, as a homicide. A couple of weeks later, the doctor comes back, having done the post-mortem, and says, well, this chap wasn't murdered, he had a heart attack, and he fell, and the blood is him falling after he died. So they recorded it as a murder, and then they take it off, so that they no crime it. That can happen, but they found that 3,000 decisions were taken to change the crime, to make it a non-crime, and about 20% of these were just wrong. And 200 of these were rapes and 250 were violence. So this is what happened. A woman reports a rape, writes it down as a rape. 2 weeks later she comes in and says, oh, it wasn't a rape. I made a mistake. And what she's saying is, I don't want it to be prosecuted. But she says it wasn't a rape. And the police take it off. Well, they've now been told, don't take it off. It was a rape at the time, recorded at the time. So this was the summary of the HMRC report. Very bad criticism of some police in some cases. And there are now a few slides which you can look at on Moodle. I won't go into detail about them here. You know, they talk 500 records in Manchester, found that 388 crimes should have been reported, but only 265 were. 10 of those were wrong, and so on. London, 948 out of 1169 were recorded, but 24 of these were wrongly classified, and it goes into the detail. Hampshire, which is where we are, we in the police force of Hampshire, they were really very bad, and they were told that they had to do things quite sharpish, and I don't know because I've not been told whether they've done them or not. They should provide more people to record things straight away and not leave them for the next couple of days. They should be more careful when they get reports, say, from hospitals, because quite often a hospital rings up the police and says, we've got something here we think is a crime. Somebody comes in with a gashed arm, which he said, you know, just accident, something happened with the car door. But in fact, it couldn't have happened the way the man says. The doctor says it's a knife, it's whatever. It must have been a real incident. And the hospital then rings up the police. And quite often the police in Hampshire would just say, oh, we're too busy, don't worry about it. Whereas in fact the police should worry about it and record it as a crime. And Hampshire didn't have the right sort of proper audits for working out what was going on. So here we have the local force given a pretty bad result. It's 2 out of 10 for statistics for Hampshire. I think they've turned themselves around to some extent, but I'm not sure. Now this is even worse. These are people in Kent who've actually invented crimes. It's not that they've had crimes reported and they've not reported them, not recorded them properly. It's that the Kent police wanted to show that they were better, and so they invented burglaries. And they went and told prisoners what had happened, and the prisoners said, all right, I will admit to these crimes, so the police get the credit for having solved them. These policemen went to jail at the end. And similarly, 2 Welsh policemen, South Wales, were disciplined because they got a prisoner drunk and forced him to admit crimes that he hadn't committed. And in the same in Scotland as well. So there are a small number of occasions when the police have been very badly behaved. And they typically are trying to get their detection levels raised by inventing statistics and, in many cases, trying to force criminals to go along with them and say, yes, I did that. And this is just a reminder that every time the policeman is told about a crime, it needn't be recorded as a crime. We could have an antisocial behaviour, people just letting off fireworks in the street. It's not really a crime, it's an antisocial behaviour. If you go and say that my old granny has gone missing, That's recorded as a missing person. It's not a crime. It might become a crime if missing means that she was murdered or something. But it's just a lost person. So that's what you record that as. And police have an awful lot of lost people they record. And then a lot of these other offences are not crimes. And we talked about cannabis. That's not a crime as defined in this selection of things. It's not what's called a notifiable offence. It's a crime in the legal sense that you're not supposed to have cannabis and smoke in. But it's not added to the list of crimes that we're talking about, like burglary, rape, robbery, etc. Motoring offences are not added. Prostitution offences are not added. Petty violence, just pushing people, shoving people, that's, common assault, that's not added. Regulatory offences, public drunkenness, I mean, you can be prosecuted, you can be given a fine, you can be even put in jail sometimes for some of these. But basically there are a whole load of less serious offences that don't get counted in the 4.1 million that we've talked about. Otherwise you would have hundreds. I mean, how many times in the course of a day does the average motorist exceed 30 miles an hour? How would you define it? I've driven 75 miles to get here today. I go back tomorrow and drive another 75. How many times have I committed an infringement? Probably, I try not to drive too fast, I try not to go through red lights, but I've probably committed some offences. I won't be caught. Is there any point in trying to estimate it? No, none whatsoever. So these less serious offences, A, they're very difficult to define, and B, if you get caught, it'll get counted in the court data, but there's no point in counting it in the crime data. Okay, so I'm going to go back a little bit. Has anyone got a question to ask? You want to ask a question at all? I'm going to go to this one, which is probably worth covering, because this brings another set of thoughts. The question is England a more violent country than Germany? I think that's a very difficult question, because each country has its own rules about what's crime and how to count it. Now, I'll pass around a sort of definitive collection of statistics on international crime. Just have a quick look through if you want to open it up. It's very boring, but it's like a telephone directory. If you want to find out how many murders there were in Lithuania, you can find it, and it's on the web. And I'm on the committee that produces that book. So you've got different sources of statistics, and they all do different things. There's the source book, which is the one you've got in front of you, which I'll pass around. If anyone is listening from remotely, this is the European Source Book of Statistics on Crime and Criminal Justice, and it's on the website of the Ministry of Justice of the Netherlands. It's in English, and you can download it from that website, Ministry of Justice of the Netherlands. And that website itself is pretty well all in English. But if you look at the right-hand side of this slide, you realize that comparing across countries is very difficult to do. The definitions are nearly all different, the legal system is different, and the police also have a different role in different countries. In this country, the police can have discretion, they don't have to report it. In other countries, anything the police come up against, they must report to the prosecutor, because they have a much lower status in many other countries than they do in England. And the prosecutor insists that everything is reported. So in other countries, there is a difference in collecting the data. The police in this country, report data as soon as they get it. In other countries, they leave it a day or two to see if they got it right, but then they have to report it if it's not contradicted. So the comparisons are very difficult. The definitions of crimes are very different. You can usually get something out of trends. You can say that the number of robberies in France has gone up and the number of robberies in England has gone up, and you're all right, you're making the same sort of statement. But it's quite difficult to say there are more robberies in France than in England. There just aren't. You just don't know that because the definition of robbery is different. I mentioned earlier on burglary in France includes stealing things from cars, so you have to be very careful. If you're looking at this book, you probably glaze your eyes over instantly because it's full of explanations and definitions, and that's called metadata. You get the figures, and then you get the metadata, which is the description of what the figures actually mean. And ESB is that book you've got, and the metadata are extremely important. And quite often, you've got, the only way of studying these figures is to do a special study yourself and spend a lot of time over it. So if you want to do an international comparison, it's best to talk to Tom or myself, because Tom has worked for the United Nations and knows a bit about this, and I also helped to produce that book. So, despite all that, you can produce a map, and the darker the blue-purple colour, the more violent crime there is. What's this? This is total crime. The darker the colour, the more crime there is, and you'll see that England and Wales is pretty heavily coloured in, as is Ireland, and that's basically because we count more things. We don't actually necessarily have more things going on in our country, but we do tend to count more things. And that gives you a broad indication of where crime tends to be a little bit higher. Not so high in Spain, a bit higher in Italy, much higher when you get to different parts like Poland and Britain or Sweden. So you can make comparisons, but they're not particularly well based. And just like I've talked about other crimes in this country, it's 10 times more difficult. There are a whole load of international statistics, and the websites are on this slide, which you can look at here. Okay, are we getting any questions at all? No? Right. Anyone got any questions you want to make about where we've got to so far? We've got about 20 minutes more. Right, let's step through the slides. Right. Because we're talking about crime, you may want to talk about something slightly different. Let's have a look. Have I got it here? Now, I mentioned last week, so those, I think you were all here then, that there are some organisations you can really trust, and they are few and far between, but one of them is this Centre for Crime and Justice Studies. And the Centre for Crime and Justice Studies produces, and I think Tom's put some of these up on Moodle, I think you'll find this one is up on Moodle. Every year they produce a justice policy review, which talks generally about what the government's done in the justice area. It's pretty critical, so they are political in that sense. They're critical whether the government's Conservative, coalition or Labour, so they're not sort of left-wing or right-wing or anything, they're just critical. And they produce this document, and I'll step through. You see, we've got, it goes through key developments, and then it's got lots of numbers, and then there's always in this annual report, there's a special set of articles, and this one we've got harm in prison, expenditure, staffing, populations, and welfare. So I'm going to look at harms in prison, just to show you that you don't always have to think about crime statistics. Prisons. Page 20, we're nearly there. Right. This is the sort of page where you get numbers, and it's worth thinking about numbers. 4% of the public sector expenditure in England and Wales is spent on crime and justice, public order and safety. 4%. Now, there are all sorts of questions you can ask about how to get that figure, but broadly speaking, if that's all you're saying, 4% is spent on public order and safety, that's about right. That would distinguish itself from somewhere like Russia, where it's probably about 20%, enormous police forces, or perhaps some other places, occasionally in South America and some of the Arab states. But 4% is about right. And then there's the drop in the UK prison population, 2,500. Okay, well, you can't really get wrong the number of people in prison. They're there, they don't come and go very often, you count them every morning, so that's probably going to be right. You take them on the 1st of January one year and the 1st of January the next year, and it's dropped by 2,581. £20 billion was spent on the Home Office and Ministry of Justice. I doubt if there's anything wrong with that figure, because we have good accountants in this country. That money was actually spent on policemen, on prisons, on judges, and so on and so forth. And there's this thing about Scotland there. But you now come to ones we'll look into a little bit more detail. 52 suicides, self-inflicted deaths in prison, up to March 2013, 12 months. 88 in the next year. Big jump. And you have to work out for yourself whether that's a significant jump. It looks big, and it probably is big, but you have to think about it. Police officers, this is where tiny figures are actually very good at describing what's going on. The number of police officers in the UK was 168,000, and it's dropped to 150,000. This includes Scotland. The number of people convicted in courts, 1.8 million. You probably can't get the number of policemen wrong. You've got to pay them all. They all turn up at the police station those days. So that's probably right. Number of people convicted, well, again, that's probably better than the amount of crime, because these people actually have to go to court, or they are on a computer somewhere. 20% drop in prison service staff. Well, I'm sure that's right, because a lot of the things about definitions and counting are much easier when you're talking about staff numbers. Let's move on to the next. Oh, well, you can look at this yourself. You could imagine that you were asked to do an assignment on something like people being harmed in prison. And you would have to dig into the statistics, find out, you'd look at the Ministry of Justice, you'd look at the prison statistics, you'd find eventually a book about it, published every year, and then you'd find a table of self-inflicted incidents. They've done it for you, that's why it's worth doing. and having a look at this particular document. So let's start. Figure 4 is not the first one. As it is. Figure 3. Figure 3, self-inflicted deaths. You see those green lines? It's 10 years worth. It starts at just over 80, and it ends up at just over 80, and in the middle it's just over 80, but apart from that it's been going up and down, mainly down and then up again in 11, 12. So, you know, you're a prison governor, you're the Minister for Prisons. Any comments on that, or do you think something big has happened?
The coalition government.
Sorry?
Well, just a minute ago there was a figure to say that the staff had decreased by 20%. So if there's not as many staff in the prisons, then that's probably going to have an effect on how prisoners are feeling in prison.
Absolutely. I think you have to think of two things, two other numbers. One is how many staff there are. Because staff, if there are not so many staff, then you're not checking on prisoners so often, and it doesn't take long to commit suicide. So if you check on somebody you think is a bad, potential risk, if you check on him every 10 minutes or something like that, but if you're suddenly told you can only check on him every 20 minutes or every 30 minutes, more people will get suicide. So that's one thing. But there's also the simple figure that these are not related to the number of people in prison. So if the numbers of people in prison have gone up a lot, you would expect suicides to go up a lot just because there are more people in prison, both because might be overcrowding and just because of the numbers. But even so, I think I would be worried about that. It's only a little bit above what happened in 2004, 5 and 2007, 8. But quite clearly, although it's just 1 year, you really have to be a little bit worried as to what is happening. Is it the shortage of staff? Is it the cutback in other things that the prisoners aren't allowed to do anymore? Gym or whatever it is, in all sorts of prisons, cutbacks have inflicted that. So you're looking at a simple figure. Is there anything wrong with the figure? Probably no. I mean, measuring prisoners, they're there. Measuring dead prisoners, well, they're there. Did he commit suicide? Well, you can't be absolutely sure, but usually you can be pretty sure. You might need to know the number of deaths that weren't self-inflicted. That would help. But basically, you haven't got quite so many questions about the accuracy of the figures as we've had up to now. So, depending on what topic you're looking at, it might be easier to guarantee the figures are all right. Now, figure 4, figure 3 was deaths, figure 4 is deaths, incidents, self-harm. Okay? And they very carefully divided it in between men and women. And any comments on that figure 4?
I would have thought it would be the other way around, that females self-harmed more than males did.
Well,
Or
they
is
do,
that just
don't they?
a-
Do, don't they?
is that-
I mean,
if that's-
Look, it's a
stereotype.
number. There's
It's probably quite representative because the population's probably got more males in it than females.
there's a hell of a lot more males in
Yeah.
prison than females. You really want a rate there. You really want number of self-harm incidents per 100 prisoners or something like that. And I think there's something like, I don't know, 10 times as many males as females. So because there are sort of the same number of self-harm incidents for males as for females, the rate for females is an awful lot higher. And that was the case for the first 5 years. And something has happened now. And then this is, far few, one female for every 20 males, it says, okay. The numbers are still hugely disproportionate. Females self-harm far more than males do. And, you know, they do this anyway, they certainly do it in prison. And the next thing is somebody else harming you. Assaults. And here they don't seem to have it broken down into males and females. That's everybody. And you have to have your wits about you because you've got two lines there. You've got all assaults in green, but they're bars, and you've got serious assaults in red, but that's just X's. And then you think, wait a minute, how can there be more serious assaults than all assaults? And then you suddenly realize that you're talking about a different scale, so that on the left-hand side you've got numbers of assaults per 1,000, a number of serious assaults per 100. So you've got two different definitions, and they've made them so they're about the same. So the only thing you can get out of that easily is the fact that in 2013-14, serious assaults jumped up an enormous amount. Ah, but wait a minute. There's another thing in this which isn't very helpful, and there's this break here, 0, 14, 18. What happened to 2, 4, 8, 6, 10? You know, that graph has been shortened so they can get it on the page more easily. So it looks as if the jump is more than it actually is. So that's a trick that people present. You present statistics slightly inaccurately. There's nothing really wrong about it because it would be you'd have a great big blank bit down here if you did it, not 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. But anyway, notice all that. That's a chart which is very difficult to read because it's got two sets of numbers, one side and the other. It is related to each 100, whereas some of the others weren't. And it's got all assaults and serious, and it hasn't got males and females. But it is explained that the assaults against children has gone down because there are not so many of them around. So that's the explanation there. So what you've got here in this little one-page thing on prison numbers is quite a nice little article about the way that prison harm has gone up and down over the last 10 years. Somebody's done it for you, so if you look at this thing from time to time, you might then file it away in your memory and say, if I ever want to write something about prison numbers, it's there. And because it's the CCJS people, I can guarantee they've done a reasonably good job on it. But whereas you couldn't guarantee necessarily if you read the Daily Mail, or if you just got a Google search and saw what was on your tablet or whatever. So that's something I wanted to show you. It goes into Scotland as well, which is nice. If you're interested in expenditure, it's got some nice figures on expenditure here, how much money was spent on all sorts of different things. Crime and policing, border control, offender management, legal aid, and so on and so forth. Easy charts to understand. How many policemen are there? Well, that's the UK number, not English. England and Wales is the green number, and that's dropped from 150 down to about 130, something like that. And the scales there, Scotland's on the right, England's on the left. Prison numbers, again, we looked at that as a single figure. These are the results of the UK government's cutting back on numbers. Probation numbers, probation staffing, if they look at probation costs, I think they would have gone down too. Here's the amount of money being paid, figure 19, the amount of money being paid to different companies, and don't forget a certain amount of that, say 5% is going to be going in profit, GeForce, Alexco, Serco, GOME, Alliance. So various different things, populations of criminal justice people. You're now moving away from crime into the area of criminal justice, but after all, that's what this particular course is about. And so I would advise you to access from time to time that annual justice review from CMCJS, UK Justice Policy Review. This is the 4th volume. You just go onto the CCJS website and it will give you all of these. There are probably about 20 different things worth looking at. And most of them are heavily dependent on statistics. So that is, having discovered a website, an institution that's good on statistics, keep at it. Don't always rely on the time you've got to spend on international and official sources. You really should go to them, but if you found a good source like CCJS, fine. No more questions now. Obviously, if we have people watching us elsewhere, they're not really interacting. So we've been through all these slides, we've done the HM inspections. The HMIC was very worried about variations in policing. The end result of crime stats being criticised is that most forces have tried to introduce a better system. Violence and sex offences have risen as counts, but they're mainly artificial due to changes in recording. And probably these will carry on for 1 or 2 years longer until the forces are all doing it. And my guess is that violence and sex offences probably not really change very much. And I know from contacts that there are some forces that have not made any change, and they will be blamed again next year, and they may have to go through the same process of improvement. It might be a year or 2 later down the line. Don't forget that there are other organisations that collect all sorts of crimes. We talked about this in terms of prosecution a few weeks ago, but if you want things like big frauds, you have to go to the Serious Fraud Office. If you want things like credit card frauds, you go to Apex, which is an organisation that tries to reduce credit card fraud. Finally, have a couple of minutes. Can you think of any other ways than we've mentioned about measuring crime? You can go to the police, you can ask households. That's the two that we've thought about. Any other thoughts? Where else would you find out about crime? I did mention one. Can you remember it? When I said the police didn't always take notice of them. Can you remember what that was? No, it was hospitals, right? Doctors in hospitals get many, many cases of injuries every night, and some of them they just don't believe what the man said, the woman said, and if it's serious and they've got time, the doctor will tell the police. So if you wanted to, you could do a proper survey of hospitals and ask the hospital A&E, of the 68 cases you got last night, can you classify them into these, obviously an accident, home accident, work accident, road traffic accident, and then could well be a crime. And you would have another measure of crime, wouldn't you? Any other thoughts? We ask households about crime, Who else might we ask about crime?
You can ask banks about fraud.
Pardon?
Banks about fraud.
You could ask companies about fraud, but you can also ask companies about other things, couldn't you? What?
Workplace violence.
Yeah, you could violence in the workplace. You could also ask them about straightforward acquisitive crime. Yeah, you could look at you could go to Marks and Spencers and say, how much have you lost in the last year? You know, there's always a write down, 4 or 5%, that they can't explain where it's got to. And they employ all sorts of guards, store detectives and all that sort of thing. So I'm sure Marks and Spencers have got a whole load of statistics about how many people they catch, how many times. I know some people are working Marks and Spencers. And what do you think they find at the end of the day? What do you think they find in the changing rooms?
Security tags.
Pardon?
Security tags.
Yes, they find lots of security tags, but they also find cheap quality seconds clothes and all that sort of thing that people have bought. With the wrong quality seconds. All my family buy things from. But you know, you buy something for £3, £5, £10. You go into Marks with them on, and you then put the Marks clothes on and leave the others behind. And that happens every day. So that's the sort of thing the Monks may find about, or Next, or anyone else that has a big turn. Last slide that we look at. You could ask commercial outlets like Co-op, Marks and Spencers. You could ask hospitals, schools, local authorities. You could ask cinemas, leisure centres, financial institutions. You mentioned pretty well all of these, and the injuries, and the other organisations. I think we pretty well covered them. Right, we don't have any questions. Right, I'm sorry. I obviously put people off. Do you have any questions? Have you changed your attitude to figures at all? Or I just made it more complicated? No comment. Is there anything you want to find out about figures?
In that book, why are some of the countries missing for some of the offences?
Well, it's a practical thing, isn't it? What we did, we had a group of about 11 people. We met in a committee and we said, right, you know, Elise, I know your name's not Elise, but one of the people was, right, Elise, will you take France, Belgium and Spain, please? Okay, so she is then in touch with these people mainly because of language. You know, the lady in Albania would talk to Albania and Bosnia and to others. And they would be responsible for collecting the figures from these places. And you'd often find that there are something like 60 countries, and you probably get 48, 50 or something. You see, there isn't a central authority that has any way of telling countries to send you statistics. I mean, why should they? You know, basically, we write and say that we're a load of people who are sponsored by the European Union. We're collecting statistics. Just send us what you've got. We're quite happy to fly out to you and chat if you like. Do please get in touch, etc. And then right at the last minute, you find the person you're talking to has been promoted to go to work on population or health or something. So it's a practical thing, really. That's all. We would have liked to have had every country. And in some cases, we got them all, but in most cases, you know, there are still some Eastern European countries, because we go right to Russia, places like that, where they regard statistics as being an essential part of the secret organisation that runs the country. So they just won't tell you. When you try to get the number of people in Chinese prisons, you just won't. You might get a figure, but it's nothing like the truth. So it's a practical thing. Okay, any more questions? Right, well, you have a break from me now. You don't see me for a few weeks. So Tom will be back. I don't know whether he's coming back now at 10 to 5, but He'll be back next week, or if he's not back, somebody else will be with him. Okay, so I wish you well. I'll see you when we talk about Japan in about 4 weeks' time. Okay? Thank you very much. And thank you to anyone who's been listening from the remote place.
Can we find the slides to download on Moodle?
Pardon?
Just got a question in, can we find the slides to download on Moodle?
They're attached in the email address, in the email that got sent.
The slides are, they should be. When they were told about this, they should be attached to that. And if there is a problem, tell them to email me or Tom.